the bloody thread that connected continents. How an ordinary liner and a handful of fanatics decided the fate of the world on September 3, 1939. Hi friends, this is your guide through the world of history, and today we're not just having a video or an article, but a real investigation. We often look at war through the lens of land battles. Tanks, infantry, the smoking ruins of Stalingrad, or the beaches of Normandy. It's understandable and spectacular. But today, I invite you to dive into the deep, literally and figuratively. There, beneath the thick layer of icy water, lies the most terrifying, the longest, and the most important battle of World War II. The one without which there would have been nothing. No victory, no Europe, none of us in the form we exist today. The topic is vast, complex, but incredibly interesting. So get ready. It will be long, it will be horrifying at times, but I promise you'll learn things they don't write about in school textbooks. If you want to understand how the mechanisms of world history really work, stick around until the end. And, by the way, if the topic of naval battles and geopolitics is close to you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the sequel. And in the comments, write what you think. Could Germany have won this war at sea if they had started building their submarine fleet a little earlier? I really value your opinion. We're a community of like-minded people here. Let's go. Chapter 1. The calm before the storm. Why everyone was looking at the land, but drowned at sea. Let's imagine the atmosphere of September 3, 1939, for a second. At 11:15 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the crackly, slightly strained voice of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain comes over the radio. He says the country is at war with Germany. People on the streets of London frown. Some sigh, some cry. But in the minds of ordinary people, it's all a jumble. Everyone expected horror from the sky, like in the movies about future wars. Everyone expected the march of armies across Europe. But the last thing they expected was trouble from the ocean. Britain had always prided itself on its navy, its ruler of the seas. Water seemed like their fortress. But on that very day, September 3rd, at exactly 7:39 p.m., an event occurred that, like a black lightning bolt, pierced that illusion of safety. 250 miles northwest of the coast of Ireland, in waters always considered a British inland lake, the German submarine U-30 launched a torpedo, and it didn't hit a battleship or a cruiser. It hit an ordinary passenger liner, the Athenia. There were over 1,400 people on board. Women, children, the elderly. Those trying to escape the impending nightmare and flee to America. And 112 of them would never see the Statue of Liberty. They would drown in the icy water because someone in Berlin decided the rules of war no longer applied. And this is where we get to the most interesting part. Have you ever wondered why, for us ordinary people, this date, September 3rd, is associated with the declaration of war, but for sailors worldwide, it became a day of remembrance? Why did Churchill, that old bulldog who feared neither Hitler nor the bombings, later admit, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril"? The answer is simple. War on land is about territory, about the ambitions of dictators. But war at sea is about life. Literally. Chapter 2. Economics versus Geography. An island trapped. Here we need to put on our economist hats. Forget about patriotism, ideology, Hitler, and Churchill for a minute. Let's look at the world map as a business scheme. Great Britain is a huge floating factory and warehouse located on an island. For this factory to work, it needs raw materials delivered every single day. Oil for tanks, iron or for steel, rubber for wheels, and most importantly, food. An island cannot feed itself. Before the war, Britain imported about 70 to 80% of its food. Meat from Argentina and New Zealand, grain from Canada and the US, sugar, tea, fruit from the colonies. Now imagine the logistics. Millions of tons of cargo, thousands of ships. It's a huge, complex conveyor belt. Now let's look at the situation through the eyes of Admiral Karl Donitz, the head of the Third Reich submarine force. Donitz wasn't just a military man. He was a brilliant tactician who understood economics very well. He looked at the Atlantic not as a battlefield, but as Britain's throat. He reasoned like this: Why should I sink their battleships? The spectacular but useless. A battleship is just one ship. If I cut the conveyor belt, if I sink merchant ships faster than they can build them, the factories will stop. Tanks won't move. People won't get bread. And within 6 months, the island will simply collapse from starvation. This was a strategy of brilliant simplicity and monstrous cruelty.
No frontale assaults, no chivalrous duels.
Cold calculation. Kill the enemy's economy by strangling it with a blockade. And the first shot on September 3rd at the Athenia was the signal. The rules of the game had changed. The world had entered the era of total war, where women and children on passenger liners became just as much targets as soldiers on the front line. Chapter 3. Wolf Packs. The technology of the hunt. Now let's break down how this worked technically. The Allies had convoys. Imagine a herd of buffalo moving across the ocean. Thousands of buffalo. And around them, cowboys on horses, destroyers and corvettes, ride with rifles. The cowboys' job is to keep the wolves from getting to the herd. But the wolves, German U-boats, were cunning. They developed the wolf pack tactic, brutal tactic. How did it work in practice? A single boat patrolled a sector of the ocean. Like a scout, it lay quietly, listening to the radio, looking through the periscope. As soon as it spotted the smoke of a convoy on the horizon, it didn't rush to attack. No, it would begin shadowing at a safe distance and radio the coordinates back to headquarters in France. Donit's staff, upon receiving the signal, would order a dozen other boats within range. Drop everything, head to these coordinates. There's fat prey there. And then night would fall. The Allies initially had no decent radar. Sonar worked poorly. The boats would surface. Underwater they are slow and blind. But on the surface they are fast and maneuverable. They would slip through the line of destroyers, burst into the very thick of the merchant ships, and begin hell. Imagine this horror. Pitch darkness, storm, the wail of sirens, explosions. Merchant ships aren't armored cruisers. One torpedo, and an oil tanker turns into a giant torch, illuminating everything around. Boats dart between burning wrecks, firing torpedoes one after another. Destroyers dart around in panic, dropping depth charges, risking hitting their own. Chaos, death, and icy water. And the worst part was the uncertainty. The merchant seamen, those humble heroes almost no one talks about, went to sea knowing their chances of survival if a torpedo hit were less than a soldier's in a trench. The North Atlantic water kills in 5 to 10 minutes. There were often not enough lifeboats, or they were smashed by the storm. Chapter 4. 1942. The peak of the crisis when the world hung by a thread. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted 68 months. From the first to the last day of the war. But there was a period when everything hung in the balance. That was 1942. You probably know that in 1941, Germany attacked the USSR, and the epic saga of Lend-Lease began. American ships with canned Studebaker trucks, and aluminum for aircraft went to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The route of the convoys we know as the Arctic convoys. But the bulk of the cargo still went across the Atlantic. After the U.S. entered the war at the end of 1941, Donitz unleashed sheer terror off the American coast. This was the period German submariners called the happy time, Die Glückliche. Imagine the rich beaches of Florida, the lights of New York and Boston, which no one dimmed. Americans initially didn't believe in the threat, and German boats surfacing right in view of vacationers, sinking tankers that were lit up like Christmas trees. The Americans had no blackout, no organized convoys off their own shore. It was a massacre. In 1942, Allied tonnage losses reached monstrous figures, over 8 million tons. More ships were sinking than shipyards could build. England was on strict rations. Food rationing became tighter than ever. Factories operated with interruptions. Churchill wrote panic letters to Roosevelt. If we don't stop the losses, the war could end in our defeat, even before it really gets started on the continent. Imagine an alternate history. If the Germans had managed to maintain this pace for another 6 months to a year, the Sherman tanks and trucks wouldn't have reached the USSR. Soviet industry, deprived of Lend-Lease aluminum and explosives, might have simply been overwhelmed. The Normandy landings in 1944 would have been impossible because there would have been no way to supply the invasion army across the ocean. The war would have dragged on for years, or perhaps ended in a compromise peace with a Nazi-dominated Europe. Chapter 5. The Intellectual Front. The Battle of Minds at Bletchley Park. And this is where we get to the point where history ceases to be just a chronicle of battles and turns into a detective thriller. Because physically destroying the wolf packs was nearly impossible. The Atlantic is huge. You can't have enough destroyers. What was needed was a different weapon, information. And this weapon was forged in absolute secrecy at Bletchley Park, an estate 70 kilometers from London. They gathered mathematicians, chess players, linguists, and even crossword puzzle experts. The star of this constellation of geniuses was Alan Turing, the man now called the father of computer science. They faced an impossible task: breaking the code of the German encryption machine, Enigma. The Germans considered it absolutely secure. Every day at midnight, the code changed. The number of combinations was astronomical, 150 million possibilities. If 100,000 people checked one combination per minute working around the clock, it would take them longer than the age of the universe. But Turing and his team figured out how to use logic and the world's first computing machine to find patterns. They looked for cribs, standard phrases in German radio messages, tides, weather reports. It was titanic work. And when they finally started reading Donut's radio messages, the situation was turned on its head. Now the Allies knew where the wolf packs were. They could reroute convoys away from ambushes. And when the Germans repositioned, they were met by hunter-killer groups, special squadrons of destroyers and escort carriers that hunted not merchant ships, but the U-boats themselves. The Battle of the Atlantic turned from a hunt into an extermination campaign. Chapter 6. The Price of Victory. Blood, steel, and 30,000 lives. And this brings us to the heaviest chapter, the numbers. Numbers are merciless. There were no picturesque battlefields in this fight, no flags raised over the defeated Reichstag. Only rusting steel, fuel oil, and bodies in icy water. The Allies lost 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships. But behind these numbers are 72,000 merchant seamen. These were people who weren't military in the direct sense. They were cooks, mechanics, sailors, stewards. They simply went on a voyage, knowing a torpedo could come at any minute. Their death was terrifying. Either an explosion or a long agony in freezing water. But the German loss figures are even more telling. The German submarine force was an elite unit. They selected the best. And they paid the highest price. Out of 40,000 submariners who went to sea, 30,000 never returned. The mortality rate was 75%, higher than in any other branch of any military in World War II. Why? Because a submarine is a case of kill or be killed. A depth charge landing close to the pressure hull means the end. Either the hull cracks and you're crushed by pressure at depth, or you sink and suffocate. Or, if the boat is damaged, you lie on the bottom, listening to the screws of enemy ships fading away, praying the oxygen holds out. Many German crews only surrendered when their air ran out and they started going mad from carbon dioxide poisoning. This was a war of nerves, fought to the point of utter exhaustion. Out of 1,162 German submarines built during the war, 783 found their final resting place on the ocean floor. The Atlantic became one vast graveyard. Chapter 7. Historical Analysis. What if? Let's allow ourselves to speculate a bit. We've understood that the Battle of the Atlantic was a war within the war. But let's look at it from a bird's-eye view, from the perspective of historical logic. Argument 1. The role of Lend-Lease. In Soviet and even in modern Russian historiography, the role of Lend-Lease supplies is often downplayed. It was only 4 to 5% of Soviet production, they say. But that percentage was the most critical. It wasn't just canned stew and boots. It was aluminum, without which you couldn't build thousands of planes. It was high-octane gasoline, without which tanks wouldn't reach Berlin. It was explosives and gunpowder. If the Atlantic had been sealed by the Germans in 1942 to 1943, this flow would have dried up. The Red Army would have fought on starvation rations. The outcome on the Eastern Front could have been very different. Argument 2. The Second Front. The Normandy landings, Operation Overlord, were a logistical monster. Imagine how much needed to be transported across the English Channel and the Atlantic. Soldiers, tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition, food, medicine. It all came from across the ocean. If German submarines had controlled the approaches to Britain, amassing this armada would have been impossible. The Second Front would have remained only on paper. Argument 3. The technological leap. War is the mother of innovation. The Battle of the Atlantic gave birth to modern tracking systems, radar, sonar. It laid the foundations for global logistics, without which the modern global economy is impossible. Those container ships now carrying your iPhones and bananas are distant descendants of those wartime convoys. Chapter 8. Personal, the human in the face of war. I often think about those people. About the captain of the Athenia, who probably couldn't believe until the very end that he'd be torpedoed on the very first day. About Fritz Julius Lemp, commander of U-30. Interestingly, the Germans initially denied everything. They claimed the British had blown up their own ship to draw the US into the war. Lemp and Donitz tried to cover it up, erasing the boat's number from the logbook. But the truth eventually came out. Lemp was killed in 1941 when his own boat was sunk. Or take an ordinary merchant seaman, an 18-year-old kid from Liverpool or Glasgow. He has no military training. He goes on a voyage because his family needs feeding. He stands watch, scanning the horizon. And then, an explosion. The ship breaks in half. There's burning oil on the water all around. He has to jump. The water is like a knife. He swims towards a lifeboat. There are screams all around. He survives. A destroyer picks him up. A week later, he's back at sea on a new ship, because there's no one else to do it. These are the real heroes of the war. Why we must remember September 3rd. September 3rd, 1939, is not just a line in a textbook. It is the day the world realized the war would be different. Not chivalrous, but total. When a passenger liner with refugees became a military target, it was clear there would be no mercy. The Battle of the Atlantic reflected this new reality. It only ended in May 1945, when the last German boats surfaced and surrendered to the Allies, or were scuttled by their own crews. But its lessons remain with us. Friends, we've traveled a huge path together, from the quiet evening of September 3rd to the icy depths of the Atlantic. We've seen how economics, technology, and the human spirit intertwine. This story is a reminder of how fragile our world is and how much depends on seemingly distant things, on sea lanes, on the work of scientists, on the courage of ordinary guys in rusty holds. If you found this interesting, if you feel that history isn't a boring list of dates but a living organism, subscribe to the channel. There are many more deep dives like this ahead. And in the comments under this video, let's have a real discussion. In your opinion, which branch of the military was the most important in World War II? The infantry, the Air Force, or was it those who fought at sea? Write your opinion. Let's read each other's thoughts. Thank you for being with me on this journey. Until next time.